Herzlich willkommen beim 35. DOK.fest München. Herzlich willkommen bei DOK.fest at Home 2020, der Online-Ausgabe des Festivals. Mein Name ist Moritz Holfelder. Ich arbeite als Filmkritiker für den Bayerischen Rundfunk. Und wir freuen uns sehr, dass wir dieses Jahr im Programm haben den Film TONI MORRISON, The Pieces I Am von Timothy Greenfield-Sanders. Eine Produktion aus dem Jahr 2019, die schon auf dem Sundance Film Festival zu sehen war, dort auch einen Preis gewann und jetzt als Deutschlandpremiere bei uns läuft. Bevor wir mit dem Gespräch beginnen, möchte ich noch darauf hinweisen, dass es dieses Jahr wieder einen Publikumspreis gibt. Der Film über Toni Morrison ist dafür wählbar. Und zwar am besten über unsere Filmprogramm-Website. Der Preis wird gestiftet von der Redaktion BR Kino. Now, hello, Timothy Greenfield-Sanders. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thank you. And you?
Surviving.
Good, me too.
Yeah.
Your film is about the writer Toni Morrison, who was awarded with the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1993. She died last year. She and you had been friends for a long time, I think since 1981 or so. How did you first met her?
Toni came to my studio in 1981 for a portrait. I have a kind of double career as a photographer and a filmmaker. And in my early days as a photographer, she sat for the cover of the Soho News, a kind of a weekly, hipster weekly in New York in those days. And we became friends at that moment. She arrived smoking a pipe, and she was, you know, as a subject, I remember her being so confident that you, as a photographer, you kind of examine your subject, you try and understand what's going to help in the portrait. And Toni didn't need any help. She was very at ease in front of the camera and remarkable, really. And over the years, I started to do portraits of her for her books, and we became very good friends.
And you did over years portraits of her, or?
I did her book covers and kind of her favorite portraits. We had a long friendship that way, and she inspired me in so many ways, but she was also the kind of the fire that ignited an idea that became a series of films that I made, which were called the list films. The Black list on African Americans, the Latino list on Latinos, the Out list, gay people, the trans list on transgender. And Toni and I were sitting in my kitchen back in 2005 maybe, and we were doing some pictures that day for the opera she had written, Margaret Garner, which was based on Beloved. And she said, we should do a book on Black divas because I've met so many amazing divas, you know, we could do a whole book on it. And that idea of kind of concentrating on a group of African Americans as a project intrigued me, and it became the Black list. And Toni was the first to sit for it. And those were talking portraits in my portrait style, kind of films that came to life that way.
And you made also a portrait of her smoking the pipe?
In the film, you see those pictures. Those are from 1981. Yes. I hadn't looked at those in, 30-something years when we started to make the film. So I went back to see what I had shot back then. And of course, they were wonderful for the film.
Yeah. The title of your film is The Pieces I Am. At the beginning, one sees the creation of different collages, kind of, with pieces of photos.
Yes.
And we are all, not just one person, but many. And what pieces Toni was made of?
You know, it was extremely important for us as in the editing of this film to kind of show that there was more than just the Nobel Prize winning author. that everyone knows. That this was a woman who was a single mother of 2 boys, 2 young kids, who was an extraordinarily important editor herself at Random House. Before she quit her day job to become writer full-time, she edited books and brought African American and people of color into a very white establishment, Random House. Yeah. You can't underestimate, or you can't, really believe how many important writers Toni brought in, people like Angela Davis and so many others. Muhammad Ali, she went on tour with, convinced him to do a book.
He was a friend of her, or
no? She thought there would be a book there. Got him to write to do a book about his life, and he was in his late 20s, I think, at that point. And then she toured with him as well.
Okay.
So she did all of this. So these were the pieces. The pieces I Am, of course, is a line from Beloved. And we were trying to find a subtitle.
Beloved is her, I think, her most...
her most revered book.
Yes.
Maybe. Yeah. And the artist who did that collage is Micheline Thomas, who's an extraordinary African-American artist, renowned, well known all over the world now. And I reached out to her to consider doing something for the opening like that, because I knew her collage work. And it's an amazing opening, I think, too.
Yeah, it's a very nice opening.
Yeah.
You can see it as a little piece of art.
It is.
Yeah.
It really is. And
then stop a little moment and then see the film.
Exactly. And the idea of bringing in African Americans and their artwork into the film was very, very important to me. And if you look at this film, there are almost 50 different paintings and drawings by African American artists.
Yeah. How important is Toni Morrison as a writer for you? What was the first book you read of her?
The first one was really The Bluest Eye. I think everyone starts with that. It's a masterpiece. It's eye-opening in so many ways. I just reread Sula a couple weeks ago for the 3rd time now, I think. And so extraordinary, the experience of sitting and reading a book like that there's almost no one in my life that can do what Toni does to me, with a book.
Yeah. You filmed Toni Morrison in the interview scenes, all of them, or most of them, in a frontal look. Mm-hmm. She's sitting in front of a gray wall and is wearing a gray jacket. Her hair is gray, and there is a gray necklace around her neck. Right. It's a kind of staging. What was your idea behind that?
I wanted to try something that I hadn't seen in a documentary, which was that one person, the main person, would be looking directly at camera, and the other interviewees would be looking off camera. Yeah. And I had never seen that done.
They're not in the middle of the picture, but at the side.
They're off to the side a little bit, but they're also not looking into the camera. They're looking off the camera at the interviewer. And it's very important distinction, because when Toni's talking, she's looking right at you. She's looking right into the lens. Yeah. And there's an intimacy that I thought could work, but the question was, could it work with the others looking away? And the answer is yes. It made it even more powerful to have her leading the discussion that way. So it was a risk I took as a filmmaker, but I think it was very effective.
Yeah. When did you do these recordings of her? How many years before her death, or which time?
I reached out to Toni in 2014, and I like to say that when I asked her, she didn't say no, which I took as a yes, because she's like this. If she didn't want to do it, she would have said, no, I'm not interested. So by 2016, I had raised the funds, and we did interviews for a couple of days. And then again, after I had done all the other interviews, we went back to Toni. And I also went back to her occasionally with a tape recorder for a word or two that I didn't have that I needed.
Yeah.
She never said the word divorce, for example. And I needed her to say that she had been divorced. So,
yeah. So the recordings are from
2016 and 2017. Yeah. And of course, they're mixed with these extraordinary TV interviews that she did starting in the 70s, well, in the 80s and 90s. So we're mixing, Dick Cavett, who's an important interviewer, with Charlie Rose and Bill Moyers and kind of all the men who are the big interviewers of the day.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think it's also wonderful to kind of see how confident she is as a Black woman talking with these white men in this context.
Yeah. What was it, a kind of a theme between you that you are white and she was Black?
I think she was in some way testing me. Toni knew I could make this film. I think there was a great deal of trust between us. She loved the work I had done before. She was very much a part of it. When I made the women's list, Toni wrote an introduction and read it for me for that film. I was thinking the other day about this as well, that of the people who are in the film, many of them are people I know.
Yeah.
Oprah, Fran Lebowitz, Hilton Ailes, Angela Davis, people I've met before through Toni or in some way as a photographer. Walter Mosley, Sonia Sanchez, people that I actually know. So I think maybe in her mind, she kind of saw that it could all come together nicely.
Yeah. And was the film ready before she died, or?
I showed the film to Toni before she died, and I sat there for 2 hours with her in her media room.
Yeah.
And she made an occasional comment here and there. And at the end of the film, she turned to me and she said, "I like her."
Okay. You said it before, you talked about before that you have a second career or a second profession as photographer. And you are kind of very famous, I think. You made photos from 6 US presidents. You made photos of Orson Welles or Alfred Hitchcock or Madeleine Albright or Hillary Clinton and so on. And your photos are in the collections of many very important museums. So your first film, I think you did 20 years ago about Lou Reed.
Right.
And what was in this time for you the point that you decided not only to make photos, but also to make them live?
It's a wonderful question. I had started out as a filmmaker. I had gone to film school at the American Film Institute in Los Angeles in the 70s. And I loved film, but it was there through actually Betty Davis and Alfred Hitchcock, who befriended me, that I became interested in portraiture. And I sort of fell in love with taking portraits because I could do it all myself. Yeah. But I never left in my mind the idea that I was a filmmaker. So when I became friends with Lou Reed in the early 90s, I started to film things we were doing together with a little video camera or whatever I could. I was gathering material. And at a certain point, I had 50, 60 hours of footage and thought maybe it was a short film on Lou Reed. And the head of American Masters, who was a friend of mine, said, no, he's an American master. Why don't you direct and produce a film on Lou? And it took me about a year to convince him because I'd never made a film. Yeah. But, Lou was, again, someone who had great instincts and I think he knew I could do it somehow. It became a very successful film. It won a Grammy Award for, my first film. And it got me back into this mind that I could do both, photography and film.
And you're doing it still. So
I am. You know, one of the exciting things about all the list films was that not only was I directing these films, but I was taking portraits of all the people. So the 9 list films, there's 150 people, all of whom I photographed, and those pictures travel to museums, exhibitions, and there's sort of many hats that I'm wearing in that sense.
So you made your films mostly about the persons you portrayed with the camera as a photographer.
You know, as a photographer, as a portrait photographer, you have access to a lot of people, interesting people. Yeah. I mean, my career is one where it's very celebrity driven, but it's really, I don't like the word celebrity as much as people who've accomplished a lot. So I look at this world that I know through photography, and I thought, how can I move that into film?
Yeah.
And that's what the list films were.
Yeah. And so have you a next project about a very important, famous person?
You know, I'm thinking in a time like this that I might do something about comedy, that there might be a film that relates to comedy in some way. So that's kind of what I'm thinking at this point.
Yeah, a comedy. You mean also?
I mean comedians. I think comedians are very interesting, dark, complicated people. So they could be wonderful subjects.
About Joker.
Yes.
He's also a clown or a comedian.
Exactly. Exactly.
But you don't want to do a fiction film, also a documentary about comedians or clowns?
I think a documentary. I don't think I'm that interested in doing a narrative feature film.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in documentary.
Okay. So let's see your film at the Munich Documentary Festival. Thank you, Timothy.
Thank you.
And good luck for your next projects.
Thank you very much. It was delightful.
Yes, nice to speak to you.
You too.
Have a good time and survive. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ja, der Film Toni Morrison, The Pieces I Am, steht noch bis 24. Mai beim DOK.fest München at Home 2020 zur Verfügung. Schaut ihn euch an, toller Film.